West Lothian, home to around 185,000 people and the fastest growing area in Scotland. A lot of things can be forgotten or lost in time, but you don't have to search very deep to see West Lothian is littered in history. Ancient burial sites over 5,500 years old, Sir James Young Simpson's anaesthetic use of chloroform, once the location of the world's largest oil refinery, but nothing comes close to being enveloped in the mystery as that of an old hospital. Bangour.
Never mind rumours, we are going to dive deep into the story behind this forgotten hospital and discuss its history from start to finish and find out what really happened at Bangour.
Located in West Lothian, Scotland, Bangour has laid derelict since 2004.
For many years, there was discussions as to where the mentally ill should be placed throughout the Central Belt. A new hospital was desperately needed in response to the increasing prevalence in mental health conditions.
Hippolyte Gibloch, a Scottish architect who was known for his Gothic revival style. Born to French parents, Blanc grew up to become an architect, designing many buildings over Scotland. He won the position to design Bangour by a competition. The layout created by Blanc consists of over 30 buildings making up a small village based on the inspiration he had from the German psychiatric village hospital Alschwitz. The reason for the village layout? To provide a calming atmosphere for patients, as if they were at a holiday villa rather than having the appearance to that of an asylum, making it one of Britain's first village hospital designs. The General Board of Lunacy bought the land in 1902 for £13,000. This in combination with construction would cost the equivalent of just over £39 million in 2021. The hospital covers 960 acres of land, consisting of a nurse's home, a hospital block and a recreation hall measuring 93 feet by 54 feet, with a stage at the north side and a floor for dancing and an orchestra. More than 30 villas are present on the land, for which each villa would house 30 to 40 patients. The asylum was not small.
General work, like tidying, cleaning, taking stuff to the wards, moving patients, or the sort of down part of it is going to the morgue.
His was not the farm work as such. It was going round with the mental health patients who collected the brock from all of the wards, and that was taken off to feed the pigs. Often he was called in with some of the other people who were doing general work and labouring work around the hospital to do things like move bodies. And we've got one famous story when he set off with a man called McBrannan to move a body from one of the long wards at the top of the hospital, and it was snow. And they collected the body and were proceeding to the mortuary, but when they got to the mortuary, there was no body. So they had to go back through the snow, tracing their steps until they could feel where there was a bit of a kerfuffle in the snow and get the body and take it in.
Psychiatric hospital was built, I think, in the sort of late 1800s. And it was, of course, the idea at that time was that society should be protected from the mentally ill, but the mentally ill should be protected from society. And of course, the word which was commonly used for psychiatric hospitals at that time was asylums. An asylum, of course, means a place of safety. So it was very much designed as a place of safety and an environment in which people who couldn't function in everyday society could be separated from everyday society, but cared for and given some form of significant function as well. I mean, the whole point of asylums was not just that they were places where people locked away, although if somebody was, their psychiatric disturbance was severe enough, they might have to be in secure accommodation. But a lot of that, if you look at Bangour Village Hospital, a lot of it was designed to give opportunities for people, the patients, the residents, to be occupied. And when I was working in the general hospital, for instance, there was a very large nursery garden, which I used to go and buy plants from every spring to plant in my garden, but they did a lot, and they made stuff. You know, you could buy concrete slabs and all the rest of it, and and most of the work was done by the patients. Nowadays, of course, you say, well, of course, they were just being taken advantage of, but it was occupational therapy, and that concept of therapy by being occupied, by being productive, was a very, very genuine one. I mean, that gave people who otherwise had been discarded by society some sense of contributing, creating, those who were capable of it. And of course, psychiatric hospitals were very much a rag bag in the Victorian period. Anybody who was dysfunctional, right from being educationally subnormal, as the term was, through to being even dangerous because they had no sort of sense of what was right and wrong, or good behaviour and bad behaviour. And that would have included people with later stage syphilis, who's had general paralysis of the insane, chronic alcoholism, anything that made people antisocial could lead them to ending up in the hospitals up and down the country, like Bangour Village.
After costing £300,000 at the time to construct, Bangour opened officially at 12:30 on Wednesday the 3rd of October 1906. However, the first patients had already moved in by 1904, and 1 year later, in 1905, there was over 200 patients and residents. Then, by the time of its official opening in 1906, Bangour had 400 patients living there. This gave an inclination as to just how big the facility was to become. such scale, the hospital required many people to man the facility. During the century of its existence, the hospital brought many jobs to the people of West Lothian.
There was an awful lot between the village and the general. An awful lot of people there. Maybe a couple of thousand or something like that. Or 1,500. I just remember you had cooks, you had cleaners, you had the nurses, doctors, all the rest of it. All the medical staff.
My name is Linda and I trained at Bangour from 1971, qualified in 1973 as a state enrolled nurse. Bangour was busy. A&E was really busy on a Saturday night. Found that very scary. My first, I think I was only in one ward, which was Villa 2, and that was like admissions, and one lady said to me that I was told I could take her for a walk around the grounds. She wanted to go for a walk and they asked me to go, and then she said she was going to hang herself with her shoelaces, and I got scared. So I went and said to the charge nurse, I can't take her for a walk. Her name was Patsy, I think. And I said, she's going to hang herself. He said, what with? I said, her shoelaces. He said, nah, you better just give her a rope. And I thought, how heartless are you? But what he was trying to make me realise is she couldn't. And I thought, she can, but maybe she couldn't. So I just went out and said, come on, we're going for a walk. And she said, I wasn't really going to hang myself, I was just winding you up. But I did find psychiatric scary. I think with general nursing, you see if it's surgical, you see the wounds and whatever. Medical, you see the condition. Psychiatric, you don't see that.
At the forefront of psychiatric medicine, it was a teaching ground for nurses and doctors. Bangour was running smoothly with many patients being well cared for, carrying out its function as a mental hospital. However, in 1914, that was all interrupted.
World War I, a plethora of battle-wounded soldiers, physically and psychologically, were being transported back from Europe as a result of trench warfare. Bullet and bomb injuries were by the plenty. This meant that there was an increased demand for medical staff and supplies. So in 1915, Bangour Psychiatric Hospital was converted into a war hospital. Psychiatric patients were transported to other hospitals all around the country, making room for over 3,000 servicemen up until 1918. Within the first 3 weeks under the War Office command, the hospital increased its bed capacity by 500, which at the time was almost double the original capacity. Wounded soldiers arrived daily on the train line, which ran straight into the heart of the village near the boiler house with 2 platforms. As well as bringing in injured men, the train brought coal and other supplies. Today the tracks are no longer there, but the imprint of the line on the land still remains. The tracks ran in from the east side of the village since 1905, but were eliminated by North British Railway in 1921.
When the First World War came along, the site of the village hospital was quite convenient from the point of view of being able to run a railway line. I mean, it had its own railway station, and a railway line could bring injured, so this is war wounded, to the hospital where they could be treated. What they did with the the long-term psychiatric patients, but I presume they were put together in certain particular blocks, because it was a very big establishment. I mean, I can't remember how many different units there were in the village when I was working in Bangour General in the 1970s. I started there in '76. So it was a very big establishment, scattered over quite a big area.
It was said that 100 patients could be evacuated from the train and into beds within 45 minutes upon arrival. This had to be fast to cope with the influx of patients. The overcrowded asylum consisted of dining areas and rooms packed full of beds. Marquees were set up on the grounds outside, equipped with many more beds for the soldiers, just to try and cope with the overflow. The environment itself was not optimal, however staff members proved to be resilient.
The hospital was managed by Lieutenant Colonel and Dr. John Kay, the medical superintendent of Bangour Village Asylum. John Kay was said to be progressive in his approach to mental health and very much cared for the well-being of all patients at Bangour, qualities which were rarer in mental health care at the time. Medical staff consisted of 1 senior surgeon, a senior physician, 6 surgeons, 6 physicians, a dental surgeon, a pathologist, a radiologist, and their assistants. The nursing staff had a matron who was in command of 150 nurses, 50 sisters as well as nurses under training. A further 50 civilian VAD nurses and orderlies were also in attendance.
Guards composed of 1 sergeant and 12 soldiers, forming a sentry at each of the 3 entrances to the asylum grounds and standing watch.
Many other workers were present at Bangour, such as plumbers, painters, cooks, tailors, shoemakers, and more keeping the village running. Water was supplied from the reservoir to the northwest of the hospital, which cost $25,000 at the time to construct and was reckoned to have a capacity of 16 million gallons of water, which was roughly a 5-month supply for 1,500 people. Today the reservoir still remains as a fishery.
The end of the First World War led to the reopening of the asylum. During the time of 1926 and 1929, the Bangour Church was constructed in gratitude to the hospital and its patients for providing accommodation and treatment to the soldiers. The church dedicated to Our Lady was designed by a Nottingham-born architect.
Harold Ogle Tarbolton. This beautiful church still stands today, perfectly preserved inside and out. The inscription, "Friend, this house of God stands open for thee ever, that thou may enter, rest, think, kneel and pray. Remember whence thou art, and must be thine end, and remember us, then go thy way." Everything seemed like it was back to normal. However, this was not to be the case. Bangour would see the effects of the war again in 1939, which led to its conversion back to a war hospital in dedication to the war effort, although this time there was an addition.
The General Hospital. West Lothian finally had a hospital for all medical needs, not just psychiatric, but maternity, plastic surgery and A&E.
Before Bangour was there, any patients had to go to Edinburgh or Glasgow because that was the nearest place for them. And it was an awful journey for wounded, disabled or whatever the case may have been.
It was the district hospital, and it must have made a huge difference to the local population not having to travel into Edinburgh or presumably Glasgow. I don't know how much business went from West Lothian to Glasgow, and it's quite interesting that, because the guy who helps me with the garden, I wouldn't dream of calling him my gardener. We're very good friends, and his wife has recently been having some eye problems, and he's having to take her into the eye pavilion in Edinburgh, which is what would have happened in the old days for anything that required any intervention before Bangour. And that involves, and she's not very mobile, so that involves train, taxi. He can't drive into Edinburgh because his car immediately attracts the congestion charging and all the rest of it. And anyway, you can't park in Edinburgh for love nor money. So, and now parking wouldn't have been quite such a problem. But think of in the days before, certainly in the days before motor vehicles, to get from Bathgate to Edinburgh to the Royal Infirmary to see a specialist there would have been train travel, but you'd have, it would be horse and cart or horseback or whatever. No, absolutely. So, no, it must have made a big difference to the local population. And also, I think, you see, it was somehow, in some way, much more personal, because so many of the people who worked there were from within the community. So, I mean, I had many patients who I had at least some social contact with, and who knew members of the nursing staff and all the rest of it. And yet that didn't seem to create any problems in terms of people feeling there was intrusion into their lives.
And as time went on, the war broke out and everything changed. And suddenly there was this new set of buildings going up on the flat land beside the farm, and this became Bangour Annex. And it was a great source of work for the local people who went to it. And from early on, there were nurses who came from the army with their patients, and they went into the long wards that were there. And I can remember as a small child going to make deliveries to the various patients, who sometimes sent money to my parents to pay for eggs that we would take up and go to it.
Just a block, corridors, the wards off it. I think we had P1, 8 in a block. So there was like P1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then you'd walk through and you'd get to Q block, if I remember rightly. Maternity was further up. T block, very seldom in T block. The nurses' home, the dining hall.
And the General Hospital, of course, was built specifically in anticipation just before the war started. So it's quite obvious that something was going to happen Nazi Germany had been developing progressively since the late 1930s, and it was, people who had the responsibility for looking into the future could see that something was likely to happen, and this time they, compared with the First World War, I think was the planners feel we've got to have something ready for when casualties start coming in, and so it was built for that purpose in the first instance.
Just busy, constantly busy. Even if you were in like geriatrics, it's busy in the sense that you've got to feed patients, take them to the toilet, bath them and that kind of thing. But you also had time in some wards where you could sit beside a patient and talk, like especially geriatrics, and talk to them about their life. And you're thinking, wow, they're 80, they're very, very old. And now looking back, I'm 72 nearly, and I'm very old. But when you're young, you think like, oh, that's amazing. They're very old. It's just, I just loved every part of it. There's nothing, I can't say there's anything I didn't like.
The burns unit, and that was something that was very important because so many of the men that went to the burns unit, they have been damaged in aeroplane accidents, naval accidents.
The General Hospital was situated to the south of the reservoir, but northwest to that of the psychiatric village. The top of the hospital had the burns unit and the physiotherapy, whilst to the south side was the maternity ward. Specialising in plastic, facial-maxillary and thoracic surgery, as well as its burns and maternity units, the hospital was world famous at its peak. Other parts of the hospital had tuberculosis wards for many years, providing a place for the infected to reside and be treated.
And they would come out there to get their TB cured, and a lot of their time was spent out at the top end of the hospital, which was up near where the reservoir was, the big wards there, and they were out in open verandas so that they would get the fresh air. And then there was the beginning of medicines coming along that started to help them. But when the TB wards, I once went with my sister to deliver a fowl to one of the nurses that was going back to the Isle of Barra, I think it was. And I was whining and moaning that I was thirsty and I wanted a drink. So I got this drink, and it was a beautiful sugar bowl. It turned out it had come from Woolworths when they were cheap, and had 3 little buttons on the bottom. But the nurses apologised to my dad. It was actually the dish that they used to put the holy water in when the priest came to give the last rites. My father was not particularly upset by this.
You're always in the hospital, even for your time in block. In student block, in the training block, you still were in the hospital. Everything was all curtailed within the one environment. Whereas now it's, we would never go out in our uniform, never. If you were caught going out in your uniform, you were in big trouble. As soon as you went off duty to the nurse's home, if you were going out, you came in, we were locked in at 10 o'clock. Some people used to go out the windows to go to Livingston Inn and things like that, but it was strict, and I don't think it is as strict as what it should be.
In the General Hospital in peacetime, and I mean, as I say, I started in the General in 1976. There was medicine, and medicine of course included respiratory medicine, cardiac, cardiorespiratory, infectious diseases, and really anything that comes under the heading of general medicine. And then there were surgical blocks, or surgical departments, which were general surgery, which when I started comprised most things except except heads, hearts and orthopaedics. And in my training I did a lot of orthopaedics. For instance, I didn't do any cardiac surgery. So when I went to Bangour, there was general surgery, which is the department I worked in, orthopaedics, plastics, ear, nose and throat, ophthalmology, and then of course there was obstetrics, and obstetrics carries with it gynecology, which is a specific branch of surgery to do with the female reproductive tract. So it's covered the whole spectrum of.
The General Hospital was meant to be temporary and was expected to last only 10 years. It by far exceeded this, as from its construction in the 1930s to its closure 60 years later. All that remains now are the concrete bases which the General Hospital was built on.
Perhaps it was the wars which led to the development of Bangour General Specialised Units, notably the famous burns unit, a unit which specialised in the treatment of burn victims and the plastic surgery which may have been required following these incidents. During these times, it was figures such as Professor Norman Dodds who founded a brain injuries unit at Bangour, bringing further specialised treatment for not only the people of West Lothian, but the people throughout the country.
All over. Like we were told, go for your breaks early, because after the pubs are shut, there'll be people coming in that's been in fights, there'll be car accidents. And one night I was asked to do my first and only, I only ever went on one police escort, taking a patient to the Royal, and his friend was driving and he was drunk and they'd crashed, and the patient that I took died. Just as we got to the Royal and handed him over, he died. And the other boy had minor injuries. And I always thought to myself, you should never drive a car with alcohol. It was kind of scary because it was like blue lights and speeding, going through traffic lights and everything with the police escort. But I was told I had to get the blankets back. Because there was always rivalry between the Royal nurses and Bangour nurses, and we had to get our blankets back that were around the patient, but the patient died just as we got in to the Royal, and I said to the doctor, I'm not going to ask for the blankets, and he says, but you have to. And I remember going up and saying, do you think I could have my blankets back? And thinking, that poor man's just died on me, a young boy of 26, and he's got our blankets on him, and I've got to ask for them back. And when I came back with them, I was questioning why, in those circumstances, did I have to do it? And they says, because you have to get tougher. And you have to toughen up. Because I cried, I used to cry a lot of times.
The piano was often taken out at Christmas time and it was put onto a trailer and it was taken to the different wards so that they could do their carol singing and have wee concerts, and people would get down to the recreation hall for the dances there, and that was a great thing, you know, for folk coming up from Bathgate and getting involved in these kind of things.
Psychiatric treatment was still in its infancy during the 20th century, and so treatments ranged from effective to terrifying and even lethal. Many forms of psychiatric treatment were being used, such as the revolution of lithium, electroshock therapy, still used in some circumstances today, and insulin.
During the 20th century, it had been observed that epileptic patients who took seizures did not present with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. This was suggestive that epilepsy was antagonistic to these conditions. This was also noticed when an Austrian psychiatrist accidentally gave a patient too much insulin and the patient proceeded to go into an insulin-induced coma. Upon revival, the patient noted a distinct increase in mental clarity. And so this led to Western psychiatric hospitals beginning induced seizure treatment or insulin coma treatment. However, by the 1940s, this was replaced by metrazole, a drug which could induce seizures almost instantly. This was not without its downfalls too, as metrazole would produce an intense state of dread in patients, making them feel as if they were about to die. After this, the next evolutionary step in convulsive therapy was the development of electroshock therapy, known today as electroconvulsive therapy, where electrodes were introduced on either side of the patient's head, and they were then restrained whilst a current was ran directly through their brain. This would trigger desired convulsions, although like many forms of psychiatric treatment in the 20th century, this procedure was overused and even abused. Other forms of treatment included the burning of the brain tissue to control outbursts of rage, but probably the most prolific of these psychosurgical techniques was the frontal lobotomy. Holes were drilled in the skull to allow access to the frontal lobes, and sections were then sequentially removed in hopes of treating various conditions. This technique would be developed further into horrific transorbital lobotomy due to the method access to the brain through the eye sockets. This procedure also went by another name, the ice pick lobotomy. This was because the method was performed essentially using an ice pick. The utensil would be placed under the eyelid of the patient until bone stood as a barrier. Then the mallet was used to strike the ice pick through the bone and into the cranial space. This procedure was developed as it did not require surgical theatre to perform, making it more convenient for psychiatric hospitals, which usually did not have surgical theatres. This may suggest that this technique was not performed at Bangour, as Bangour had various specialised units dedicated to surgery. Many sedative drugs were used which brought about Parkinson's-like symptoms. Eventually, lithium's effects on disorders were discovered and ousted invasive procedures. Occupational therapy involved giving patients work to do at the hospital. Patients were taught skills such as shoe and clothes manufacturing to provide some form of distraction, as well as developing skills that would be of use to them once they left the asylum.
One of the very important parts of the hospital's work was plastic surgery, and it's always Mackendu, who worked in England, who got all the credit and all the information goes out on films, was passed about that. But it was a Dr. Buchan who lived in Dechmont and worked at the hospital, was a very skilled plastic surgeon, and he did so much rebuilding people's faces and skin grafting to make them feel better.
I mean, it was very much a community, and I think, interestingly enough, working at Bangour, one was definitely had this a more intense sense of community, partly because many of the staff lived relatively locally, so they were part of the local social community as well as the professional community. Obviously, you had there was a hierarchy, so if you start at it's easier to start at the top and work down, because that's where, for my sins, I was near the top. So you'd have the senior medical staff, you would have their juniors who were all in training, and then you'd have students, so that's the sort of medical cohort, and the staff would be, in surgery, would be the surgeons, their assistants, then the anaesthetics service, which was very important, and not just to put people to sleep, but pain control and all the rest of it, management of sort of physiological disturbance of various sorts. So you had the medical staff in the broad sense, then you had the nursing staff, and they would be both highly specialist, highly trained people like theatre staff who, a good theatre sister was worth her weight in gold. She knew everything each of her consultants would do for a particular case, was prepared for it. And this is another thing which I hear again and again, is I never operate with the same people twice. So how on earth can you build up team experience. I mean, if I would publish an operating list for the next day, and the theatre staff would know exactly what I was going to do and what I was going to use all through the day. And so you almost never had to ask for anything, because a bit of intelligence had been applied to, well, we need that for that list, and he usually uses that particular instrument there. So there was the theatre staff and nursing staff, both senior, and they were very hierarchical. The nursing staff were run by the matron, and then below that you had the various sisters on the units, both on the wards and in theatre. And then there would be specialist nursing staff who worked with the anaesthetists and so forth. And then there'd be auxiliary nursing staff who did more of the patient care on the wards. And of course there would be students alongside these people as well. And then there'd be a whole lot of technical staff. So in the operating theatre, you'd have theatre technicians who knew how to make sure the anaesthetic machine's working, or whatever else, electrical equipment, diathermy equipment and so forth, all being handled by people who knew how it worked and checked that it was in working order, etc. Right down to, then there would obviously be technical engineering staff. It's no good having an operating theatre if you don't have a light that works, and that you didn't want to find out the light didn't work when you were about to start an operation. You wanted to know that the light would work because the electricians regularly checked everything and made sure it was working. And that would be true down to the wards with the refrigerators where the blood was kept, in coming from blood transfusion, waiting to be delivered to patients, etc. So it's a huge, complex team of people.
I think it just provided everybody with the security that there was a good hospital. I mean, Bangour had a fantastic reputation, mainly for their plastics and their burns unit. But if you see people now and you talk to them, when you hear them say, "Oh, I was in Bangour," or "I had my baby in Bangour," it was a brilliant hospital. I've not heard anybody say anything bad about Bangour. And yeah, it was old. It was an old wartime. Was it barracks or a wartime hospital, I think?
The general, yeah.
Yeah.
Hospital, yeah.
But I don't know, it just had something. I don't know what it is, something magical about Bangour. And it was like one big family.
And if you want teams to work, the absolute essential element in a working team is respect for everybody else's function, and not respect for status, respect for what people were doing and providing. And that went right down to the domestic staff, because if things weren't clean, that's when you get infection. So, at the start of the operating list, you never had to go around checking that things were dusty. You knew they weren't, because the theatre domestic staff would have cleaned up after you were there yesterday and done exactly what they were supposed to do. And then you had all the portering staff who brought stuff when it was required. I mean, it's a very complex business running a hospital. And I think one of the problems is that you've got to have people who are managing complex technical organisations who actually know how it's done, know what is actually involved. And when you get managers who think they know but don't, that's when things get difficult. And of course it's all money as well, and you've got to be economical.
Many famous doctors worked at Bangour, including Alexander Burns Wallace, who worked in the hospital during the Second World War. Wallace would go on to be the doctor who published the Rule of Nines in 1951, a technique in medicine used to determine body surface area affected in burns victims. Other doctors who walked the corridors of Bangour, including Donald MacLeod, a pioneering surgeon who wrote a book about the hospital titled The Bangour Story. Pioneering doctors was not a new thing for West Lothian. About 100 years previous, there was Sir James Young Simpson, the discoverer of the anaesthetic properties of chloroform. But Bangour became a place to channel great minds, such as Wallace and MacLeod. As Alexander Fleming said, light does not burn until brought to a focus. Although this place was once full of famous doctors, it is allegedly not only famous for channeling great minds.
Today Bangour is said to be dark, haunted ruins, infested with spirits and gruesome history. Surprisingly, these talks are not a joke for some. A lot occurred here in the hospital over 100 years, but exactly what is unknown. Accounts say Bangour's Ward 10 had to have a priest perform an exorcism, and other wards were the homes to tormented souls, victims of illness and shell-shocked veterans. Accounts of former staff say that strange things happened in the wards, feelings of uneasiness.
Aye, when I first started here, I was told to watch out for ghosts and weird noises and stuff like that, because it was haunted, supposed to be. But I must admit, I never ever saw or heard anything. I've been in different old places where you get like a cold feeling or maybe hear something. It could only turn out to be a window or a door or something, but you don't know it. And it immediately brings your mind back to Bangour, with them saying haunted.
How much of this is true we do not know, but the famous graffiti my mum put me in here and the ha-has that are scribbled over the buildings, with broken windows and the smell of dampness, do create a dark atmosphere. What is clear is that there is mystery surrounding this hospital, but there are also some unpleasant truths.
In 2007, 566 unmarked graves of Bangour patients were discovered. Patients who died and had no family to bury them received a basic burial in an unmarked grave. Bangour may have had a church, but it was unwanted to have a cemetery on the hospital grounds, as this may be unpleasant for other patients.
As the 20th century drew to a close, so too did the doors of the General Hospital in the early 90s. In 1974, it was decided that a new hospital would be built, St John's. Eventually, the doors of the psychiatric hospital would be closed, and in 2004, this once thriving hospital, at the cutting edge of psychiatric medicine, was left derelict.
Well, I mean, the whole thing, apart from even psychiatry moved to, acute psychiatry moved. There was a psychiatric presence in St John's, but obviously we were moving into a modern building, and there's no doubt that the buildings at Bangour, which were put together, I mean, there were basically wooden buildings on brick foundations, on concrete plinths, And they'd been thrown together very quickly, just at the beginning of and before the Second World War. And they were pretty much past their sell-by date, and it was quite right that we should have a new hospital.
And it was so different when the hospital closed and it moved to St John's.
No, I do not agree with shutting it. I think it was part of the history of this area, and it should have stayed open.
They just was a specialness about the whole place.
And I go into St John's and it's just totally different. I don't feel, I think in Bangour, because it was all blocks and corridors, you felt, I don't know, you felt warmth in Bangour, and in St John's it doesn't have that, it doesn't give me that feeling, but maybe because I'm not nursing now.
But the new hospital was, I think, extremely well designed. And if you go into St John, I've been back to St John's a few times as a patient, going to cardiology, for instance. And I go in and I say, this place looks no different now than it did the day we moved in 1988, 89. Because it was well constructed, good materials. One of the most impressive things I think about St John's is the inner walls of all the corridors are brick. They're not got panelling or anything on, so you know it's rough surface brick. It's beautiful material. You cannot do graffiti on it.
If I was young, that's what I would choose to do. I would do it all over again.
So, is that the end for Bangour? What happened next? Well, the hospital went on to be the set for the movie The Jacket, produced by George Clooney, starring Adrian Brody, Keira Knightley and Daniel Craig, which was based on a psychiatric hospital. The area has also been used for police and military training. But now, the hospital grounds have been bought over and Bangour is marked to become a village, consisting of homes, flats and a school. This conversion requires the demolition of multiple buildings that were a part of the original design. However, not all buildings will be destroyed, as some are destined to be converted into homes and other facilities.
Just like in 1902, today there is a rise in mental health conditions and a lack of resources to help. We must reach out, be patient and provide hope and comfort to those who need it.